We do have time for questions now if persons can go to the microphones if they have questions. One question that I have is for Lillian and for our company representatives, and that's how we hear about the pediatric programs within companies and developing PROs and experience with PROs, and then the academic research within COG and academic institutions. And can you talk about how you can learn from each other and how we'll keep from siloing within a company, within an academic center, and what strategies you have for that?
I think that's a great point. I think the siloing isn't just between the pediatric academic group and industry. It's actually much more profound than that. I think we're completely siloed from the non-cooperative group, pediatric research community, the adult community, from which I think we have a lot to learn, in addition to industry. So I think there is a major need to bring together like minds to be able to learn what is the best approach to go forward. But I think industry is a tremendously important partner in this initiative.
And once again, I agree with you. But yeah, I also think it takes effort. I think in order to break down some of those silos and really get good collaboration, you have to work and proactively work with the cooperative groups, with academic centers, with clinicians to make sure that, and with patient advocacy groups to make sure that we are getting a very robust collection of individuals contributing to what they think is important, what we should be measuring on trial. So I think, yes, it happens, and I think it is very profound, and it definitely takes a lot of work to get those silos broken down.
And I'll just add leadership. I think that somebody would have to take the initiative to bring this group together, and I don't know who that right person is, but I think somebody would have to come to the table.
And I would add to that, so this speaks to those research and development incentives. So I think that this is an entirely untapped arena, which we have not gone into. So I think that the traditional way that everyone thinks about incentives is how do you tack on someone's exclusivity at the end of their development phase? And that's unreasonable in today's environment, frankly. So are there opportunities for cross-portfolio collaboration where companies can be incentivized through potential earlier discussions with agencies to escalate their review timelines? There's all sorts of different ways that we can talk about this that would enhance collaboration across industry. Certainly that does not necessarily speak to the academic and investigator needs, but from an industry perspective, that's one way to do it, because oftentimes even if it might not be a commercially lucrative indication, there is still commercial concerns about sharing information early. We might be told even by the regulators that there's a tool being developed by one company, and we might contact that company and they say, we're sorry, we can't allow you to utilize our tool, so we have to start over from scratch again. So I think that there's ways that we need to think innovatively about opening up the pathways for early discussion too across companies.
And I can just, I'd like to add to that also, and even just take a step back further to some of what Lillian said, and more so than incentives and companies collaborating. There needs to be a core set, validated approach. And I thought about this question quite a bit as I was developing the talk. And I think I recognize, and everybody at the table recognizes, that when we're developing drugs for children, and there's just not there's a lot of challenges with the patient-reported outcome is probably the most succinct way to say this. Possibly, again, collaboration is going to be the key, but first, where do you start? I still, when I look at proxy versus self-reporting, I think one thing touched on was the age gaps where you have the young adolescents, but then you have very young children. There's a lot of variables that have to be worked out first, but it is important.
Greg Riemann from the FDA. I just wanted, I'm glad you started with the questions about PROs, because I wanted to comment on Lillian's reference to the FDA guidance. And I just wanted to point out, not surprisingly, like most FDA guidances, it wasn't developed for children. I don't even think the word children is in the guidance. So I think there's a real opportunity here. We can talk about challenge. It is a challenge, but from challenge, we can make it an opportunity. There is interest at the agency, not just in oncology, but in other areas, in children with inflammatory bowel disease, and other areas to really look at PROs. We started having some discussions, as I mentioned, and the comprehension issue for children less than 8 is an obstacle. But again, I think this is an opportunity for us to be creative, to merge or integrate proxy outcomes, reported outcomes, as well as patient, not caregiver, but patient and family reported outcomes. And there was another point I wanted to make, which I forgot. But the other thing is that I think, Lillian, you also focused a great deal on symptoms. And I think symptoms are important, but they tend, especially in pediatrics, I think, to be influenced by multiple concurrent signals. So function is probably more quantifiable, which is something that the agency has a real interest in. So I would really look at opportunities to explore functional assessments as well, which in the long run I think are as important, if not more important, with respect to quality of life. So some thoughts.
Hi, good morning. I'm Bryce Reed with the University of North Carolina. I'm thankful for the panel and to the hosts of this for this amazing conference and meeting. And so I'm actually, it's the right time to stand up because it builds on the comments that Dr. Reedman and Dr. Lillian Sung and many has made there. I do see an incredible call to try to bring all these different stakeholders into the same room. Actually, I think we're actually in the room right now. It's an amazing think tank sitting around here of ways for us to think about collaboration. And so I would encourage, if anything, recommendations come out here of the ways to bring all these stakeholders into a common core group. That way we can synergize our efforts and build from these things to build standardized measures, to identify common core PROs, and to make sure that we're working collaboratively together. And so I strongly encourage representatives from the FDA, from the NIH, from the NCI, from industry, from sponsoring organizations, and from the academics to get the research together. So just to build on these things, a few comments that were made. And Dr. Sung, you said that a lot of your recommendations were your recommendations. I think if we took a poll, I think a majority of us would actually sign on and say it's our recommendations going on here. A few things to note is that you had made reference to the NCI Canada and how their ability to incorporate PROs onto many of their oncology trials. And I think that represents sort of the overall sort of support and foundation from the leadership of NCI Canada. I've also looked at that question as well when I worked for the Cancer Institute, looking across our cooperative groups for adults. And the NCI Canada is actually very different from the other adult cooperative groups, whereas at NCI Canada, they assume that every single clinical trial should consider having a PRO in a study. That is the assumption, and then it's the job of the investigator to justify why they shouldn't have a PRO if they feel that that's not an important part of the thing. And so if there's any recommendation for the COG and for other cooperative groups to consider is maybe they should adopt that same mantra is for every study we should think that that there is a need for a PRO and justify why there shouldn't be. So I would certainly recommend that. The other thing that you had in terms of your many recommendations is to have core PRO instruments as well as core PROs to assess. You'll hear tomorrow some conversation from Dr. Pamela Hines and from myself about 2 NIH NCI support initiatives to develop common ways to measure symptoms and functional impact. And you'll hear about the PROMISE effort tomorrow, as well as the effort, Lynn, you're also involved in, is the PRO version of the CTCAE. And that's developing that common ways we measure both outcomes but also toxicities associated with oncology trials. In addition, I also agree with the ability to identify what are the core symptoms and functional impacts we should measure in oncology trials. So to the extent that this working group that we propose here is able to come up with a common set of symptoms and functional impact to measure, to the extent that is commonly measured in oncology trials, puts us in a unique ability to do a unique comparative effectiveness research studies. And then just to come one last recommendation you made, Dr. Sung, is that, and I agree from Dr. Riemann as well, as again, because children represent different developmental stages there, is we need to make sure we have metrics to follow that child from a very young age to an adolescent, teenage age to a young adult stage. And again, you'll hear Dr. Hines talk about the work of Promise to Develop, which is developing the links between the pediatric and adult measures. And I think there are some good models we can learn from those particular initiatives. So thank you.
Lillian, did you have any comments or?
No, just that I'm in trouble when Bryce calls me Dr. Sung, but but I agreed with everything he said.
Okay.
Peter Adamson from Children. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
Actually, it's nice to have Peter here too, because I'm Eric Sandler. And my question was, and it's actually great to have all of you here. So you've all identified the pieces that your organizations contribute, but in some of my work with the ACS and others, I learned a word that's called nimbleness. And so with, Beth Ann, you did this with N of 1, where you were able to synthesize all this information from various organizations, put it all together, and do real-time PRO and make adjustments. But when we're talking about doing this on a bigger scale, so cooperative group, pharmaceutical company, NCI, how do we put this all together so that maybe we can be more nimble so that we can get answers a little bit quicker? It's not just regulatory. I think there's pieces we can all take responsibility for.
So I think that's a great question, Eric. I think I didn't talk too much about the advantages of ePROs, but one of the major advantages to me is the ability to incorporate those PROs into clinical practice in a meaningful way. I think the adult settings have done this much better in general than pediatrics, where they've managed to be able to use the PROs in real time, especially if you can get it into your electronic medical record. I think that's an achievable goal. It just requires thought and requires IT partners. So partnerships outside of the people in this room, that's the one group that we may be missing right now, is real representatives from IT that can help us design feasible systems that will work across different electronic medical records. Did I answer your question?
Peter Adamson, Philadelphia. Dr. Sung. No, I'm just.
Okay. I'm really in trouble.
No, if anyone ever wonders why Lillian runs it, it was on display here. I mean, she's a tremendous leader within Children's Oncology Group for these efforts. There are two stakeholders that are not in this room as far as I can tell. One are the European regulators, the EMA. And the reason industry is here today, not individuals, these are all great people and I actually know all of them, is because of requirements from the European Medicines Association, EMA. They're essentially driving most of the show right now, and as Malcolm opened with, there are good parts of that, but there's some very unintended consequences of that, including primarily what happens when you drive a drug-centric view of the world and try to impose it on a disease-centric view of research. And we are headed to some major challenges with that we shouldn't underscore. But the other stakeholder, and I apologize if I'm wrong, but there are some people who work down the street. I think actually you just go straight down the street. And that's Congress. PRO and the research that Lillian and others have spoken about, and the ideas here today, are incredibly important. But the idea that we can do more with less, of course, is nonsense. We will do less research with less resources. And if you just look at the absolute spending dollars to the Children's Oncology Group, which reflects a decrease in funding to the NCI. We have, over the last decade, have about a 30% decrease in dollars. So we cannot do all these important initiatives unless we convince the people who work down the street that these are important initiatives. And so we do have to change the dialogue. And you've heard this throughout the day. Yes, childhood cancer is a success story. We got to move away from that. It's still the leading cause of death from disease. The price our children and our families with children with cancer pay is unacceptable. And the only way we're going to instill a sense of urgency is if we get the community together to say, this is unacceptable. We need to really instill that sense of urgency that we have to change what we're doing and not that childhood cancer is successful. So, you know, what Lillian and others have pointed out and the initiatives where people have filled in the gaps like LLS and others, highly important. Can we do this without industry? Absolutely not. But what will drive industry are better incentives. What will drive a lot of this research is better funding.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Hi, Tina Shi. I'm economist from MD Anderson Cancer Center and also a member of National Cancer Policy Forum. I want to make a comment about, I heard people talk about economic and also cost effectiveness analysis, and I think people collecting PRO data need to be very, very careful that information collected from PRO usually cannot be used in cost effectiveness analysis, because what we need is health utility information, cost data. Those are not being collected. So I mean, I've run into many situations that investigators come with me with trial, like PRO data they collected in clinical trial, but we couldn't use the information even if the data is available to us because they don't have the information we need. And then the other comment I want to make is sometimes when payers look at information, a lifetime cost effectiveness analysis is not what they're looking for, because payers are not, they're more short-sighted. So a lot of time they want to see evidence of budget impact modeling. So I think for us to really want to provide the evidence that payers need, we need to collect the kind of data that they are looking for, and then we also need to run the kind of analysis that would be helpful for them to make decisions.
Can I respond? So thanks. I actually had a slide on utilities that I actually removed in the interest of time. I mean, we understand the requirement to collect utilities. We do have a cost effectiveness analysis recently activated with Hodgkin's disease, where we're comparing a strategy of brentuximab versus no brentuximab, and our measure of utilities is the health utilities index in that study. So in much the same way that there are issues with PROs, proxy versus self-report, we have exactly the same issue with utilities, right? What are we going to do, get standard gamble utilities from children? Probably not. If you know what that task requires, it's a pretty cognitively heavy task. So I think the same issues just resound and require the same kind of thought process that we need to do.
Lori Manassian, National Cancer Institute. Thank you, Lillian, Malcolm, for a wonderful session. One of the things in the challenges in developing the patient-reported outcomes are fairly significant for the pediatric community, especially if you're going to be measuring the patient-reported outcomes over the trajectory of time. Even if it's 5 years for a kid, that's a long time and a lot of developmental change. So the challenges in developing the tools is one piece. But I think the bigger challenge, and what you didn't point out from the data that you presented on the pediatric health-related quality of life assessments, how do we use that data? How do we incorporate the patient-reported outcomes into the design of the clinical trials in meaningful ways so that we'll get out through the analysis an understanding of either the symptoms specific to the disease or the subjective toxicities from therapy, and have some sort of overall understanding of the risk-benefit from the patient perspective. And so that's the challenge beyond just the development of the tools, is how do we integrate them into the study design, and then how do we analyze them in meaningful ways?
I think I'm completely with you on this. I think that being able to use the information, the results of studies is critically important. We're actually trying to do that right now with several people in this room to try to look at the results from the CNS tumors where quality of life studies have been embedded. And it's turned out to be incredibly difficult to get that data and to be able to combine that data, because that's exactly what we want to do, is have those studies inform our next generation of studies. There are many barriers, but I'm sure we could work together to resolve them.
Oh, I think that's the tenor of the workshop, and I totally support the partnerships that need to happen as a consequence to that. And so I would also echo that I hope the dialogue doesn't end with today's and tomorrow's discussions.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add one comment to that, and so that I think that we utilize these tools for many different purposes. And so along those lines of the dialogue that's important is the purposes might be very different from the standpoint of clinical utilization and drug development utilization, and so for purposes of advancing programs from one stage to the next. And so I think that's a really critical piece for us, especially in terms of thinking about de-risking early development for innovator companies, is we need to identify the tools that will help us get to that next stage and what pieces of those tools are the most critical for us to do that in our dialogue, not only with investigators, academicians, and the regulators.
And if I could add just one more thing. I agree. I think dissemination is key with what we do with it, and I also agree using it to make a decision point is very helpful in those early stage designs. When we're looking at phase 3, this is where we can take a page from the adult world and you treat it like any other assessment, and that gives it the same importance when we're working with investigators and sites to make sure this isn't the questionnaire shoved off to the side that doesn't get administered. So I think when you have that up front and it's treated as just like any other assessment, hopefully planned for as a secondary endpoint where we can really get some valuable data, I think that raises its profile with investigators, with patients, and then gives us more data that we can use to share back.
Oh, I had to change the topic, a question for Lee. And you know, you described a number of exciting programs and drug development initiatives. One that I'm sure Peter Adamson is happy about is your SCORE program, you know, for Bill Carroll and the PH-like leukemia, because it's collaborating between COG and the specimens they've collected, the clinical data. And I wonder if you could say more about how you see Leukemia Lymphoma Society collaborating with other groups like COG and how important that is.
Right. That collaboration with Bill Carroll is an important one to us. In fact, we have put additional money into that collaboration. And the way we did it was when we recognized that the study could be expanded for different types of leukemia, we came up with $100,000, and then I called the St. Baldrick's Foundation and said, why don't you match us? And that concept of collaboration across foundations, I think, is very important. We're also collaborating on a quality of life study for the Hodgkin study that was mentioned. So collaborative studies and cooperation with the government, COG, is valuable to us. Sometimes difficult to manage because what the COG wants to do and what we want to do, sometimes the speed doesn't match. Sometimes the money doesn't match. And so we need to do a better job of that, because I think there really are more opportunities. And certainly children's oncology is among the best in terms of operating with a collaborative group. They seem to be, you know, I give you guys a lot of kudos, that you know, highly organized and access to patients that is unique to many of the cooperative groups. So it's something that we would like to do more of in the future.
This is for Lee, and you know, what do you think that the pediatric cancer community needs to do something for the other cancers and childhood cancers that are beyond the leukemia and the lymphoma? How could your program at LLS help our community, and what is it going to take?
All right. Well, some of the research that comes out of, for example, the CAR T therapy, which really sort of begins in ALL, that concept of applying CAR T to multiple tumor types, it's happening. And so In fact, combination chemotherapy and chemotherapy started by Stephen Farber back in 1947 grows out of the blood cancer work. So I think there are multiple opportunities to leverage what we've learned in blood cancer. I think one of the things that along the way, besides the therapeutics, sampling and mechanism of action. And we've been able to do that because blood cancers are typically accessible to know what's going on. That, developing the tools to analyze what's happened to the patient on a molecular level, whether that be, is the disease still there? Is it really there with an ultrasensitive method? Is it changed? Has the genomics changed? And to be able to follow the patient over time is a lesson that we've learned. Sometimes we've learned the hard way in terms of getting resistance, and then it's really problematic.
Bob Knoll from the University of Pittsburgh. I'm also the chair of the Behavioral Science Committee within the Children's Oncology Group. And just to add to this conversation, within the Children's Oncology Group, we have a freestanding protocol that it doesn't use patient-reported outcomes. We do assessments of kids directly with the kids. And I think there are some places where patient-reported outcomes might not be quite as significant as different methodologies in terms of evaluating children. So related to brain tumor studies in the Children's Oncology Group, we have 6 ongoing clinical trials that are linked with our behavioral science protocol to look at neurocognitive outcomes over time. And I think there are alternative strategies. I really do support in every way the patient-reported outcomes, but I think there are also some other tools that we need to think about in terms of what we evaluate. And I would just point out that within the Children's Oncology Group, again, there's been this amazing standardization to be able to use the exact same measures that are extraordinarily reliable and valid and predict future functioning for children.
No, that's a great point, and it's an important study that you described.
I just wanted, maybe you could amplify on this. And this brings up the concept of quantitation. How much of a change is it measurable becomes really important. It's not that I don't feel good today. It's can you measure it? And maybe you can amplify a little bit on the cognitive assessment tools. Can that really be quantitated?
So I absolutely believe that yes, the quantitative assessment of cognition can be measured in reliable ways that predict things in the future. To state an obvious example, if somebody has a brain tumor and at the beginning of treatment we evaluated their IQ directly and it was 100, and then we followed up with them a couple years later and their IQ was 70, I think everybody in the room would be that would make a quantitative impact. You ask a more fine-grained question in terms of, well, what is a significant difference? I would give a personal response to that. At 3 to 5 points would be clinically significant, and certainly within the opportunity that we have within the Children's Oncology Group, we actually do accumulate large enough samples that we can detect differences that small to the point where then we need to make clinical decisions about does this really make sense or is it only statistically significant. Is that?
Okay, well, we are at 12:30, which is the time for the lunch break. So we'd like to thank all of the panel members, the speakers, for their outstanding presentations.